welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Gianluca Arbezzano, who joins us from Torino, Italy. Gianluca is a senior staff software engineer at Packet and an open source maintainer and contributor. Gianluca Arbezzano, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common traits of a healthy and well-maintained software code base?
Well, I like when I work on projects that I don't have to think too much about how to inject new code into them because everything looks like easy and very comfortable in some way. And I understand that it requires testing and documentation and also a very well shared, set of foundation across the team and people, because it's very easy to write code, when everything is new. But when code bases become old, it takes way more to have a line of code that it should be. So I like to work on projects when I see that, it's possible to extend them in some way because, there are a lot of thoughts about how to do it.
And do you think that's a problem with the curriculum of software programming education process, or do you feel like that's a hard thing maybe to teach at that point?
Yeah, I think it's not really, it's something that you learn along the way. And I think it's something that people in the team have to set. So guidelines or, design patterns or architecture decisions that you make have an impact on the future of the project itself, of the code base. And if you take them wrong, they will, the code base will suffer. But I think that also developers that has to work on the code base will suffer on them. I find myself a lot of time thinking about why is this code so complicated to extend? This feature looks very simple, but I can't do it in a simple way because I have to think for half an hour just to figure out, where to touch the code to get what I have to do. And I think we are in a position to do good structuring code. It's just harder because as a developer, we like to complain and we have opinions and we all know something better than others. So sometimes we just have to step back and say, whatever we do is fine. Just make it clear because that's what we need.
And you mentioned when you're working on things that you're like, oh, this should be in theory a simple feature or task, implement into the software code base, but then you have to kind of get that mental model of the whole system or try to figure out how it's going to interact with every other pieces. Do you often find yourself or within your team using phrases like technical debt often?
Yeah, not really in the position where I am now because I recently joined a new company. So for me, it's everything new. But back in the day, we definitely had some problem where the code base was so big that we weren't even able to figure out why the code was there, what it was doing. And that was definitely technical depth that was coming from lack of communication or lack of documentation or, I think there is a lot of value on writing issues, writing pull requests because they stay there with the code, if you can connect them in some way. And when I'm there looking at the code and there is nothing more than a bunch of conditions, my mind starts to do a lot of questions about why it's that condition like that, why we have some for each there. And sometimes all those stuff can be super clear if I can build a little bit of context that it's outside of the code itself. And I think a lot of teams that I work for didn't really get that. For them was very, the code was crucial because as a developer is what we do all day. But there is more that we have to, try to figure out.
Has it been in your experience that technical debt has sometimes been mislabeled? You or someone on your team might have called something technical debt that you might not think nowadays is being considered technical debt versus is it just bad code or is it a scenario where you knew that you were making some sort of trade-off and you would maybe later on go back and refactor that or, finish doing a more thorough job on that code base?
Yeah, I think early in my days, as a developer, I was the concept was very tied. The concept of technical depth was a lot tied to code. That's it. I mean, if the code is not good, that's technical debt. But I learned that techniques get far away from code time to time. Like, as I said before, you have like documentation, you have like issues, you have comments on those issues, you have discussions and like docs that are shared like years before about the topic, and they are there lost in the darkness of Google Drive. All those stuff builds, in my opinion, in the opinion that I have today, technical depth. So it's not really like something that I was convinced about when I started was like the code is technical depth. Everything else is something else. It's process depth or whatever. I don't know how to call it. But for now, I think I'm convinced that everything that touches like what you are doing as a developer, like designing and architecting and documenting what you are doing, or answering pull requests and issues with commands, code review, all of that, if we don't do it well, that creates technical depth.
I hear you on that one. I'm so curious about, I recently, when I was doing a little bit of prep for this, I saw you had written an article about documentation. Actually, it was a topic that you had written on your blog earlier this year. And a couple of things that you touched on in there was related to making it like a regular part of your process and things like that. And knowing also maybe the distinction of where you should document different types of information. For example, you had touched on who's the, like maybe the intended audience or the stakeholders involved in, for who needs to kind of be aware of this information. Can you share for our listeners a little bit of kind of like a recap of that? Like in terms of when you're going to produce some or write some documentation, when do you decide it's better to document it outside of the code versus like inline code documentation?
Yeah, when I wrote that article, I think I wrote that because I realized there are a set of stuff that you have to develop as early as you can, even more in open source, because I work a lot in open source, but I think it applies for like other scenarios as well, like more traditional companies. And some of them are like a good testing environment, and a good documentation is another one, because those are habits that you develop. And let's say that you write like a code base that doesn't have a place where you can share documentation for like a couple of months, you will end up not having documentation or not having person that writes documentation, because they don't know where to go. Like it's too deep, the effort to write documentation for the first time when there is no documentation. As long as you go without it, as harder it gets to catch up with your code. So that's definitely one of the things that I had in my mind when I wrote that. So wrote documentation as early as you can, even if it is a doc folder unstructured in your repository, that's better than nothing. So that's definitely one of the feedback that I learned on myself, and that works. So decide where to throw your verbs that doesn't apply to everywhere else. In a directory, in a folder, and that's enough. Somebody may come as a technical writer and will help you, or you will, take a week to make order on all the mess that you now have in the documentation folder. But not having anything is worse than like having something bad, because you lose context moving forward, and that context, you will never get to the context again. So that's definitely one. And about like stakeholders, there are different people that write documentation, like it reads documentation. You read documentation or write documentation for yourself. So you are the developer and I'm writing the code, and I feel like I have to stick a note about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I think in that scenario, I usually tend to write stuff in the documentation, in the code itself. Even has a big header. I'm fascinated about opening C code bases that has like these gigantic headers that that they are longer than the code itself, because I think they give you a good context. And as a developer, we love to stay in our editor, and so it's good to be there. So when I'm writing something for myself, I do it like in the code base. When I'm in the mindset of somebody else, like can be a user or can be a manager, I usually tend to select another place.
That makes sense. One of the things you mentioned about deciding where to put documentation is important, so that early on, maybe in the process, or at least having a foundation so people know where to contribute. I've been in teams, I manage teams, and sometimes I find that there'll be maybe disagreements about where that should happen. And so then nobody makes a decision on anywhere. And so it's like, well, since we can't decide on what the best place to do it is, let's not do it at all, I suppose, in the meantime, until someone comes up with a stronger opinion. And sometimes I feel like it's just like that one person having maybe a slightly stronger opinion, be like, well, I'm going to start doing it here, follow along. And if you want to propose a different approach, let's do that. But like, I feel like it always ends up needing at least one person to kind of drive it forward, to be like, nope, let's do it here. I'm doing it here. Follow this pattern if you want to continue contributing. Maybe also mentioning that hopefully someone else doesn't start doing it somewhere entirely separate, and then you have multiple places that for the same type of documentation, and then that's not helpful either. So I think it is a challenge for teams, but I think you make a good point of just starting somewhere. And I know that like having a docs folder in your repository is probably a good place to start doing that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, like the decision making and developers tend to, have opinions and, create friction at times. So you have to be able to figure out if it's time to, to make a stamp and say, okay, I'm going to be the one that take the decision, or we're going to get out from this meeting with a decision no matter what. Or if it's the case to say, okay, I want it, but I don't care. So when we're gonna place it wherever somebody says it's good enough, because I just want to throw the things that I have in my mind in some place that we stay forever. So yeah, it's not easy.
You mentioned that you work also on open source projects, and I know that was going to be a topic we're going to dive quite a bit into. If I understand, you contribute to open source projects pretty much on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, and right now, since I joined Packet, I'm a software engineer in the developer relationship team. So my job is mainly to make the community and the customers capable of like interacting with Packet API, and we do it like doing Kubernetes integrations or Terraform integrations and stuff like that. Previously, I was working at Influx Data, that is the company behind InfluxDB. So for us, open source is the core of the company itself. So yeah. And that's also how I learn how to code. So for me, it's like community is important.
Nice. And, within the open source world, and, do you think there's a difference in how open source projects approach and deal with technical debt and thinking about those types of decisions versus when you're working on, say, a product that might be driven more by sales and marketing needs and things of that nature and the product needs? Do you find that there's quite a stark difference there?
Yeah, I think there is a difference, but the difference becomes bigger and bigger as more as the project grows. So if it's a small or a project or a solo project, open source project, you are almost capable of driving by yourself or with a group of people that may be selected like in people that has your same mindset. So in that case, it's easier. But when the project becomes bigger and there is more, interest from the community and everybody has more opinions on that, and usually open source projects that I contribute to are targeting developers like Docker, Kubernetes, or InfluxDB itself. And in that case, there is a lot of attention on the code that gets written. So usually if you open a random pull request against Kubernetes, you will see a good amount of commands and code review for all of them, because we are all developers and we are all willing to help each other. So that's good. But I think it's way easier to get code reviews in open source than in a closed source environment, because there are more people that are willing to help or that has touched that code before. So you have way more contributors than your company one. So that's the main difference for me, I presume. It's also, it's harder when you get contribution from open source because there is no clear ownership or stakeholders. I mean, it's mainly the person that knows more around the code that you are touching in open source is the person that has a strong voice on it. In in your company, your manager or the sales team or whatever drives the opinions are there. They have gravity because they can decide, what's important or not, and they can say, okay, this has to be done because we have a contract that pays our bills. In open source, that doesn't really happen that much. So yeah.
You mentioned that you kind of started to learn to program within the open source. What were some of those early types of projects that you found yourself getting involved with?
Yeah, in my early days, I started with PHP. So I started as doing websites and WordPress and Joomla and this kind of stuff. I studied like 6 months in the university and I left because I was like happy to, work and try to, challenge myself in that way. So I ended up taking my first job as a solo developer and I did a CMS like 3 times because the first time was like spaghetti code and I wasn't able to figure it out at some point. So I made it in object oriented and I made it again with a framework in PHP. And yeah, like the evolution that I had was driven by me, like on ERC, like pinging people and like asking for help. That's how I learned like how to code. That's how I learned that there is a lot more than my small office room because I work from home, so that's it. There is way more outside, and when I can, I try to help. When I can't, I try to ask, and that's a good way to grow. So yeah, that's it. That's how I started, and that's why I'm here. So
It's I have some like a similar story in some ways of, I spent a lot of time on IRC back in the late 90s, in the early 2000s and things like that. And then, so yeah, a lot of my programming was hanging out in PHP, Ruby, programming language channels, Nginx channels to ask people for, help there. You were working on some of your own projects back then. And then when you started contributing to open source projects, and maybe, do you remember what some of your first pull requests looked like, or were they even pull requests at that point yet, or?
Yeah, they were already pull requests. So I was born in the age of cloud computing. So
Okay.
that's it. But yeah, I mean, I think my first contribution comes to like Zen framework. That was a very super popular PHP framework. That was the one that I pick up like because I was in their ERC channel. And there is also like Enrico, that is a guy, like it was a maintainer there that it lives in my same city. So I joined his meetup and he showed me a bunch of stuff. So that's how it started. And I think I made some contribution there at first, but it was small stuff like some bugs that I probably find in the validator form package and stuff like that. So
Nice. For those listening who haven't yet taken that step to actually contribute to an open source project, what advice would you offer to like a developer that's maybe junior or mid-level developer they're feeling a little intimidated about the idea of, oh, I'm going to go tell some open source project maintainer we should make this change to make things better. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I'm happy to share some of the stuff I learned like when I started and that I'm learning now that I'm in the other side for some projects. Like the CEO for GitHub recently said that the first way you have to contribute is to like clone the repository. And when I heard that, it was during the GitHub Satellite or GitHub Universe. I don't remember the conference, but like the first time I heard that was like, okay, that looks very obvious to me. But after a couple of days, like remembering that sentence, I mean, I thought it sticked in my mind, and I think it works. I mean, even after like 8-9 years contributing to open source, I started to clone more repositories because that's how everything starts. As soon like if you do npm install or composer install or go mod install, and you have stuff as a dependency, you feel like in another layer. So you feel like those are other stuff. This is not code. This is just something that you consume. But as soon as you clone it and you have in your Git folder in your laptop, that becomes your code. And as soon as it becomes your code, like code that you own, like your mood stuff changes. So I think that's a very good advice that I tried on myself, and that works. So clone the repository and then make it like close nearby the code that you write, because it takes another like point of view. Another feedback I'm happy to share is that you don't need to be like a developer or like a strong developer or whatever to like, I don't define myself like a strong developer either, because I'm not really like, I don't go super deep on topics. I like to scratch the surface and know everything I can know, but I'm not really like that kind of learner, let's say. And but even for myself, like I can do any contribution on code. Like I'm part of the SIG release in Kubernetes. That is the group of people that manage the release for Kubernetes itself. And I don't write any code as part of that group. I have other 5-6 people working with me and trying to manage the bug triage side of the release. And we don't write any code. We just, read issues, read pull requests, and we try to push them and make the authors or the reviewers to do their job effectively. So that's a contribution that doesn't require code. You don't even need to be a developer for that. So yeah, I think you just have to you just have to put your face in the first line. If you're opening an issue because you think something that matters, you have to transmit that to the maintainer. So you have to show me that you care about it. When I see an issue with the title and one sentence, I really get upset because that's not valuable for my time. And for anybody's times. Like, tell me about your use case, even if it's crazy, and tell me that it's crazy. I mean, I open issues and say, this is a corner case. Nobody should do that, but I find myself doing that. So how can I get out from it? So just share that. Share whatever comes to your mind. Don't be, too strict on, or don't summarize too much. Just tell me why you're opening this issue, because that's the most important stuff I can do.
Yeah, maintainers, they want to be able to help deal with it, especially when there's issues versus, say, a small improvement or feature requests, which may not be needed by everybody. I'm an open source maintainer myself for a couple projects, and there's always that balance there of being like, what sort of ways can I make it easy for people to use the tools that I'm building or I've released, but also when they're submitting a pull request or just an issue, like providing some good details. I think that's some good advice there. Do you find that as a maintainer, you've found some good ways on how to make it easy to solicit that information, or to even get you mentioned like pulling down the repository for your project? Do you feel pretty good about the documentation that you have on how to get things up and running in the first place for your project, so that you're reducing the barrier for someone to actually clone the repository and then use it somehow?
Yeah, that's a nice question, because we have a lot of like different setup. Everybody like has its own tools, its own workflow, and a lot of people I love to make my own like workflow for everything, because I like to clone stuff and touch them in some way. So it's very hard to write documentation that covers all the possible use cases. So I think when I write documentation, I try to open the door for that scenario. So my setup is one of the possible setup. So be clear that this is the one that I use, this is the one I tried, and leave a place for other people to share their setup. Make those setups as valuable as the one that I use or that you use, because don't judge them just because they use a different editor or whatever. So now we have, in the DevOps, we have like Terraform, and we have like Ansible, SaltStack, and Vagrant for local environment. Now there is Docker. Tomorrow will be like something else. So you can write a setup guide that works for everybody. So just write a bunch of them and keep the door open for contribution, because that's an easy way to get contributors, because everybody will have to make its own step to the setup some way. So if you can find one that works for him, just stay open for contribution.
Nice. You mentioned on the whole idea of like one of the CEO of GitHub suggesting that one of the first ways to contribute to open source is to clone a repository. And I was, reflecting a little bit on some of the aha moments I've witnessed while pairing with other software developers at times when we might be debugging an issue in a internal product application or whatever for a business, and they're like, well, we're having this weird issue, and we're interacting with this dependency, something's not working right. And so they're like looking on GitHub at the code in the browser, trying to make sense of where the things are. And then I'm like, you have that code on your computer, like you've downloaded that dependency. And I'm like, what version are you running? Like, because maybe the version that you're looking at by default is like a main or master branch in a repository. Like, what version are you working off of? And they're like, oh, let me go switch that in the browser and in the GitHub thing. And they go select that version, and then they're looking around. I'm like, let's just go open what's actually already on your computer, probably hidden in some dependency directory. You can open that up, and then we can add some debug statements in the code and see what it's doing there. And they're like, oh my gosh, you can do that. And I'm like, it surprises me how that's not more known. So I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, that's true. I think you make a good point. Like, it's cultural. Like, people that don't really look a lot at open source like code, they think that their dependency is just whatever, a monster.
Some binary file.
Yeah, an obscure piece of code, but there are actual code has the one that you write behind that. So just go and check it.
It's true. So I know that one of the projects that you help maintain is called test containers, like helps with Docker-related integration tests. Could you tell us a little bit about the types of software projects that might benefit from it?
Yeah. I think I like to write code that I like to write tests when I write, a new feature. And usually it depends on the code that you write, but you will find yourself like, it's way easier to write integration tests, or it's way easier to write end-to-end tests, or it's easier to write unit tests. It depends on the code that you are writing. I wrote another article about testing that explained like how I think about testing, and I'm not like a TDD, BDD person. I write code that when I write tests, I write it because it makes my development faster or it makes my code more solid. I have that kind of mindset when I write code, and in order to make it effectively, I have to have all the possible test suite I can imagine. So sometimes it's a unit test because maybe there is a lot of computation and not a lot of like integration with other code. Sometimes it's like end to end because I don't even know what I'm doing, so I have to write a test from like the outside or from the far away. I can write it. And like test containers is a library. I'm not a Java developer, but at some point I find myself like contributing to Zipkin, that is a distributed tracer written in Java. I discovered that they were using this nice library called test containers Java. Or you can think about that like a wrapper around the Docker SDK, but designed with testing in mind. So it's the API for the library is designed to be written inside a test. And what does it mean? It means that you can, in one line of code, in two lines of code, you can like create and destroy a container. So in this way, you can do it like inside a test case. And the library is designed to spin up like containers that don't collide with the ports. So you can open like Nginx like 100 times on your laptop, and it will always use a different port. So you can run those tests in parallel and those containers in parallel. So I really find it was a cool project. And at that time, I didn't see a good library in Go that was doing the same. Unfortunately, I discovered that we had one already, because usually there is one, but I discovered that like way later. But still, I think having a community of people like that has the same purpose across languages is super helpful, because I maintain the Go version, but there is the Java one, the super popular one, and there is the Rust one, and the Node.js one. And all those people working on the same challenge, we are sharing a lot of information, a lot of experience, a lot of the setup that we spoke before, and a lot of the CI environment that we have to deal with are cross-pane, because the Java people has the same problem we have, and the Node.js one runs on Circle CI in the same way we run Go. So there is a lot of exchange that we can do on that. So, and I think it's super valuable. And yeah, it helps you to write, like to programmatically write your environment in the language you use. In my case, Go. So I'm gonna stick with Go from now. So when you can deploy like a bunch of containers, like even the one that from your application, because you can build from a Docker file programmatically. And yeah, I find it a very effective way to write end-to-end tests, mainly because I'm very familiar with Docker, probably. So I just have it everywhere, and give it a try.
Nice. Do they have a version yet for Ruby, out of curiosity?
I don't know on top of my mind, but I think maybe there is. I don't know.
So are there, when you're reflecting on open source projects, are there any code metrics that you tend to keep an eye on or measure across your projects that you work on? Do you care much about code metrics?
Not really. Probably I should check more of them. But I mean, the last experience I had that I think is related to this question, the test containers project growth, luckily, like now we count almost like we are close to 600 stars, and the community is growing there. And since I wrote documentation for it, like in a static website, like the community is growing even faster. And I noticed that the number of issues were related to like incompatibility or lack of like resiliency were growing. And that's where I stopped to do everything else. And that just took 2 weeks to do like bug fixings, or I like scan for race conditions and I fix all those, stuff that weren't critical because the community wasn't that big and the code wasn't that widely used as it is today. So I don't know if it applies to your question, but the number of issues in some way triggers my attention a lot, and the kind of issues as well. So that's why I use labels a lot. So I every time a new issue comes, I tend to label it as soon as I can, so I will have an overview about the kind of issues that I'm facing.
Nice. Do you also take advantage of any sort of like linting tools or anything in your process to kind of help reinforce a coding style guide?
I tend to use only what I cannot avoid, let's say. So I'm not super passionate about like linters or static checks, but in Go, we have a very good community around that because the Go formats are part of the compiler. So there is a format that is the one that Go decided that is the format. So for me, like the Go FMT, Go lint, Go vet are stuff that I run all the time. There is another popular one that I don't use that often, but for Bitcode bases that where performance are critical, like we use it for InfluxDB. That is like a database, so the complexity there is different than like other libraries that I write, and it's called static check. The project is called in that way. I tend to onboard them when I see the need for it, for what is not standard for the community, let's say.
We'll be back with my interview with Gianluca in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Also, do you know someone in the industry who I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Gianluca Arbezzano. I'm wondering about, you were talking about earlier about, you worked on PHP projects and that was a part of your profession at one point, or you were working on like open source projects and stuff with PHP and building CMSs. At what point did you start to realize you were working on existing software maybe more often than working on brand new software? Was there a point, we talked a little bit about that, how that's not something you learn necessarily through the education process, but most software developers, when they get their first job, probably aren't working with a blank canvas and be like, okay, brand new application at this new job by themselves as a new budding junior developer. As you look back on your career of working on other people's code bases, do you remember any, for lack of a better phrase, horror stories or bad memories about really complicated challenges that you dealt with?
Yeah, I have to say that I didn't, in my career, maybe sadly, I didn't really have the opportunity to start brand new when I was working in a company. Definitely in open source that I had more chance to do it. But yeah, one of the story that I will remember forever, like it was my early days, and we realized that years after running that code. In PHP, you have there is this set of libraries that do iteration. So you can take an object and iterate the object B from A. And you set a strategy and you give the object and you find data in the other new object. And that's how it works. You may have the strategy that use camel case and calls like the function name and iterates the other object for that with setter and getter, this kind of stuff. And like we used to, like one of my colleagues wrote a function that was taking an object, serializing the object, replacing the name and for the object, for the class, and like serializing it back to an object in PHP. I mean, there are a lot of possible side effects that you can get from this practice, let's say. It was a huge, it was the core object of like the application. So a huge one with methods that like was developed in like over 10 years in like multiple versions of PHP. So it was a gigantic like monster. And to be more effective and to avoid writing like a huge like iterator class and strategy and test it, he just made that trick. Years later, we were refactoring that code and we realized that and was like, oh, this is scary. So we're gonna like, and why is it working? And we realized that it was working only because the length of the class name, the two class name were the same length. Because the PHP class for serialization object works only for at the time was working. I don't know if it was the same, but only for that trick was working only for that fact. So it was like just lucky, super lucky, let's say. And that was one. Or I remember the first time I made a queue on AWS. You use like SQS and you get charged like every time you pull from the queue or something like that. And I forget, or I didn't know, so I forget to place a sleep. So my worker was like pulling like constantly from the queue, and luckily my company had good threshold and for me, so and they got notified and they fixed that before it became like a huge bill. But that was another like fun story, mainly because I never like at that time it was my first time writing a worker, so who knows, I didn't think about that.
No, it's like you use these things sometimes. Yeah, those are always fun little stories about the weirdest bugs or the weirdest things you've implemented yourself, or when you've ran up an AWS bill because you left something going or something. It always surprises me how often like we'll work on other companies' projects because we're a consulting company up here at Planet Argon, and we sometimes we'll get invited to an AWS account, and I'll be like looking around. I'm like, what are these EC2 instances? And they're like, people are like, I don't know. I'm like, it's been running for like 6 years. Does anyone know what this is for? No. Does anyone have a way to log in? No, I don't know. It was here when I joined the company, and you're just like, can we temporarily just turn it off and see what happens? It's like, and so things like that. Just those can always be kind of like sometimes we can end up feeling like we're heroes because we can come in and be like, we just saved you hundreds of dollars a month because we asked the question of like, can we turn that off? Like, what is it being used for? So clean up after yourself, I think, maybe is the thing to think about. A couple of quick last questions I wanted to touch on here. If you're thinking a little bit about your career and you touched on how your idea of like how technical debt has maybe changed over the years, do you feel like you had another strong opinion maybe 6 to 10 years ago that's drastically changed since then?
Well, I think probably the way I communicate, I have more opinions about how an effective communication should happen. So I like to write more than what I used to do in the past because I think what I write stays there over journeys. I also I have opinions about where to write, because if I write on Slack, it's almost like speaking for me. If I write on issues or on Jira tickets, they stay there forever. If I write on Google Docs, I know that it's going to be like forgiven at some point, or it will stay there forever. Nobody will read it or find it again, because like Google Drive is like this black box when you write stuff there and nobody's going to find them anymore. So yeah, I think that's a way to have an effective conversation and a way to communicate that stays is something that is important. And also like asynchronous communication. So now that we are working remote, and I work remote like from 5 years now, and it's something that I learned effectively also during the open source contribution that I did, because there everything is asynchronous and everything has a time zone that is like unknown. So yeah, for me it's very sustainable, the fact that I don't have to do, I try to keep the number of recurring meetings as low as I can, and I try to have an agenda for the recurring meetings. It's something that I didn't used to do. All those small stuff all together are good, and makes like a project maintainable and easy to figure out in the future for yourself in the future.
I think you make a good point on the agendas and having consistent agendas. You try to keep those in a pretty well-organized fashion each time you have those meetings as well, just so that I feel like it's so helpful for everybody to know what to predict how those meetings are going to go. Like, oh, I understand how this meeting goes. This is how we can contribute. This is what I need to do to prepare to come to that meeting or conversation. And you were talking about how you used to spend a lot of time maybe on IRC. So like Slack, IRC, real-time communication, mentioning asynchronous communication, which is when you might take maybe a slower path of perceived as being slower, where you might spend more time writing out a much longer response to something versus quick back and forth little responses in a GitHub response. Like it's really cheap to spend, write a sentence or two, quick snappy thing, but don't expect the other person is awake to even reply quickly. So it's like you want to spend the time to like provide enough context so that when they come back and are looking at it, you can kind of keep moving the conversations forward, hopefully, or at least let them just spend the time to kind of write a longer, more thoughtful message. So that's something that I've been wondering and been curious about too, just myself, as far as how my own business runs, because we're all located in the same time zone, same city, but we all work at home now because of the virus and stuff right now. And we're struggling with, wait, maybe we're doing too much real time, and that's actually hurting us in our productivity, because there's always a conversation to have to like look and see if you need to be part of or not, and that can be challenging. So any tips for me on how to help my team get more comfortable with asynchronous communication?
Yeah, I think there is also like a skill. It's experience. Like when you are learning something, and like in my early days, I was learning like the learning process. Like I was developing the habit to learn how to be an effective developer, and like the journey at that time, probably long issues or mails wasn't what I was looking for, because I was looking more for like a mentor or like something that I didn't have any idea about where to go. So for me at that time was different. As soon as you get in the habit and you understand how to learn and you can be effective by yourself, it's probably better to start writing long issues. And probably like one of the way I try to sell asynchronous communication is by using the output of the asynchronous communication. So link comments from GitHub or links issues from like Jira and stuff like that, because you save time. Because if you write and never read or never use what you write, it can be frustrating. I understand that, but as soon as you see that is a cycle that you have to that grows and grows over time and gets useful, I think it's the best way to onboard people on that idea. I also like, to go outside and have free time. And if your day is full of Zoom meetings, you can do it because you are always there, like checking your calendars, like, all the stuff. So I like to take a break when it's too warm outside or inside. And I can do that effectively in a synchronous communication world. I need emails, I need time, and I like that. So for me, it's also something that I really enjoy more than, it's effective to me and I like that. So it's a good combination.
Great. So as we kind of wrap things up, quick few last questions. One, what non-software development related book do you find yourself most often recommending to people?
I'm actually reading right now a book that's called Obsessed, and it's from Emily Hayworth, and it's about like building a brand that people love from day one. And I'm transitioning a lot to like reads that come from other people's experience, because I think there is, like technical challenges are good, but people are more complicated sometimes. So are often more complicated, let's say. So I like to get new ideas from real experience and from other people. So that's good. And it has a lot of tips about like how to communicate effectively what you think and how to picture like your idea in your mind and how to communicate that efficiently. So I think that's good, because you can be like the smartest person ever, but if you can communicate that in a good way or make it understandable, you won't be effective as you can be. So.
I'll definitely include a link to that in the show notes for everybody. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online?
Yeah, I ramble very often on Twitter, so you can follow me there. And I have a blog where I try to wrap all my rambling together. And yeah, so see you there.
Awesome. Well, it's been such a delight having you on Maintainable, Gianluca. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was so much fun.
Maintainable.